A former slave interrupted an auction and paid everything he had for a 19-year-old girl who was being sold. The crowd was shocked, but what he did next surprised everyone even more. When the secrets came to light, a conspiracy was revealed, and their lives changed forever in ways no one could have imagined. A story of courage, redemption, and true love. Get ready, because this story will touch your heart and show you that sometimes a single act of kindness can change the destiny of many people. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like on this video, and comment where you're watching from. The crowd fell silent when the young woman with downcast eyes was led to the platform. The dusty ground of the town square seemed hotter than ever, and though no one spoke it aloud, everyone knew this scene would never be forgotten. What few could imagine was that the man who would interrupt the auction came not with gold in his pockets, but with a history of pain hidden behind every callus on his hands. What he would do next would not only shock the entire town, but set in motion a change no one believed possible. For 3 long years, the man had lived in seclusion on the land he inherited after his wife's passing. A former slave who had managed, through his own effort and studying by lamplight in secret, to earn the right to plant in his own soil. Silent, steady, with eyes that rarely strayed from the horizon line, he did not seek trouble but did not run from it either. What he sought, though he would never admit it, was peace, and perhaps deep down, a chance to repair what the world had done to those he loved. The young woman, for her part, was everything he had once tried to protect. She was 19 years old, with the hollow eyes of someone who had seen more than she should have, and an obedience trained by pain. Her parents, ruined by debts, saw in her a last resort to maintain appearances or keep their possessions. The auction was not officially announced, but everyone knew. Good health, gentle spirit, complete service, they said. With each word, she seemed to shrink a little more. Thomas Whitmore stood at the edge of the crowd, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps, where such business was conducted. He had not come to town for this. He had come for seeds and salt, for the simple necessities that kept a man alive on 40 acres of red Georgia clay. But here he was, watching something that made his chest tighten with a familiar ache. The auctioneer was a thin man with a voice that carried too well. He spoke of the girl as though she were livestock, listing her qualities with the same tone he might use for a young mare. Thomas felt his jaw clench. He recognized that tone. He had heard it before, about himself, about his mother, about people whose names were never spoken with tenderness. The girl's name was Rebecca, though no one used it. They called her by her father's name, Hartwell, as though she belonged to the family legacy, rather than to herself. Her father stood off to the side, not meeting anyone's eyes, his clothes pressed but worn thin at the elbows. Her mother was nowhere to be seen. Some said she had taken to her bed with shame. Others whispered she had left town entirely. Thomas knew James Hartwell by reputation, a man who had once owned a respectable farm but had made poor choices with cards and drink. When the war ended and the world shifted, Hartwell had struggled to adapt. Unlike Thomas, who had found a way to purchase his freedom through years of secret savings and careful planning, Hartwell had only known how to take. Now, with debts mounting and creditors circling, he was willing to trade his daughter's future for a few more months of avoiding the inevitable. The bidding began low. A few local men called out numbers with casual cruelty, as though they were haggling over feed corn. Thomas felt his hands begin to shake, not from fear, but from something deeper. Something that had been building in his chest for 3 years of lonely evenings and empty conversations with his late wife's memory. Margaret would have known what to do. She always did. When they were both enslaved on the Brennan plantation, she had been the one who taught the children to read when no one was watching. She had been the one who saved scraps of cloth to make dresses for the little girls, who sang lullabies in voices that turned work songs into prayers. She had been the light that made even the darkest days bearable. When freedom came, they had dreamed together of a different kind of life. They would have children who would know their own names, who would sleep in beds instead of on dirt floors, who would learn letters and numbers not in secret, but in the bright light of day. But Margaret had died of fever 2 winters after they were married, taking their unborn child with her. Thomas had buried them both under the oak tree by the creek and had not spoken to another soul for longer than necessary since. Now, watching Rebecca Hartwell stand with her hands folded and her eyes fixed on her shoes, Thomas felt something in his chest crack open. She was not Margaret. She was not the children they had never had, but she was 19 years old and afraid, and that was enough. The bidding reached $12. Thomas stepped forward. His voice, when it came, was steady and clear. $30, he said. The crowd turned to look at him, and he felt their eyes like physical weight. Some faces showed surprise. Others showed something darker. Thomas Whitmore was known in town, but not welcomed. He was the former slave who had somehow acquired land, who paid his taxes on time and kept to himself. He was an oddity that made some people uncomfortable, a reminder that the world had changed in ways they were still learning to accept. The auctioneer paused, clearly taken aback. $30 was more than anyone had expected to pay. It was more than many men in that crowd made in 2 months of labor. For Thomas, it represented most of his savings for the coming planting season. He would have to survive on hope and hard work until harvest time. But he did not hesitate. When the auctioneer asked if anyone would bid higher, Thomas added another $5 for good measure. The silence that followed was heavy with shock and speculation. Rebecca looked up for the first time, her eyes finding his across the crowd. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Thomas saw fear there, but also something else. A flicker of curiosity, perhaps. Or hope. The gavel fell, sold to Thomas Whitmore for $35. As the crowd began to disperse, Thomas walked to the platform where Rebecca still stood. Up close, she looked even younger. Her dress had been mended several times, he noticed, but the repairs had been done with care. Her hands, though soft, showed signs of work. She had not lived a life of leisure, even before this day. He spoke quietly, so only she could hear. He told her his name, though she likely already knew it. He told her she would be safe on his land. He told her she would have her own room, with a lock on the inside of the door. He told her she could leave whenever she chose, that he would not prevent her. He saw her eyes widen at this, as though the concept of choice was foreign to her. James Hartwell approached them then, his face flushed with what might have been relief or shame. He had papers to sign, he said. Legal documents to make the transfer official. Thomas nodded and followed him to the courthouse steps, where a clerk waited with ink and parchment. As he signed his name, Thomas was struck by the irony. Once, his own sale had been recorded in similar fashion. Now he was the one holding the papers. But these papers, he decided, would be the last of their kind. Whatever happened next, Rebecca Hartwell would not remain a piece of property to be bought and sold. How exactly he would accomplish this, Thomas was not yet sure. But Margaret had always said that the first step toward freedom was refusing to accept things as they were. The walk to his farm was quiet. Rebecca followed several steps behind, as though she was afraid of presuming too much. Thomas tried to think of words that might put her at ease, but found none that did not sound hollow. Instead, he focused on the path ahead and the promise he had made, both to her and to himself. The farm was modest but well kept. Thomas had built the house himself, with help from the few neighbors who would work alongside a former slave. It was larger than necessary for one man, which had been part of the plan when Margaret was alive. The extra rooms had stood empty for 3 years, gathering dust and echoes. Now, at least one of them would serve its intended purpose. He showed Rebecca to the smallest bedroom, which faced east toward the morning sun. There was a bed with a quilt Margaret had made, a washstand with a mirror, and a chair by the window. It was not grand, but it was clean and private. When he pointed out the lock on the door, Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. She did not speak, but she nodded once, quickly. Thomas left her there to settle in and walked to his own room. He sat on the edge of his bed and stared at his hands. They were shaking again, but now he understood why. For the first time in 3 years, he was not alone in this house. For the first time in 3 years, he had taken action, instead of simply enduring. The feeling was both terrifying and exhilarating. That evening, he cooked more food than he had prepared in months. Cornbread and beans, with a bit of salt pork for flavor. When he knocked on Rebecca's door to call her for supper, her voice was soft but clear. She would be out in a moment, she said. And she was. They ate in silence, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the quiet of two people learning each other's rhythms, testing the boundaries of this new arrangement. Rebecca ate carefully, as though she was not quite sure the food was truly hers. Thomas found himself eating more slowly than usual, giving her time to take what she needed without feeling rushed. After supper, Thomas sat on the front porch, as was his habit. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and the evening air carried the scent of honeysuckle and approaching rain. To his surprise, Rebecca appeared in the doorway. She asked if she might sit outside as well. The question was so formally posed that Thomas almost smiled. Of course, he told her. This was her home now, for as long as she wished it to be. She could sit wherever she pleased. She chose the steps rather than the chair beside his, maintaining a respectful distance. They watched the sun disappear behind the trees and listened to the first tentative calls of night birds. When full darkness finally settled over the land, Rebecca stood and thanked him for the meal. She disappeared inside, and Thomas heard the soft click of her door lock engaging. It was a sound that should have made him sad, he thought. A reminder that she was still afraid, still expecting the worst. But instead, it gave him a strange sense of satisfaction. She had choices now, even small ones. She could lock her door or leave it open. She could eat as much as she wanted or as little. She could speak or remain silent. These were not grand freedoms, perhaps, but they were real ones. Thomas remained on the porch until late, thinking about the day and what it meant. He had acted on impulse, driven by memories and conscience rather than careful planning. Now he would have to live with the consequences. The town would talk, of course. Some would assume the worst about his intentions. Others would be puzzled by his actions. A few might even understand. But their opinions mattered less than the simple fact that Rebecca was safe tonight. She was sleeping in a bed instead of worrying about where morning would find her. She had enough to eat and a roof that did not leak. It was not much, but it was more than she had possessed that morning. As he finally rose to go inside, Thomas thought about Margaret and the dreams they had shared. Perhaps this was not the family they had envisioned, but it was a family of sorts. Two people who had known suffering, now sharing the same roof and the same hope for something better. Margaret would have approved, he thought. She had always believed that kindness was never wasted, even when it seemed small. The next morning brought new challenges. Thomas woke to find Rebecca already in the kitchen, attempting to prepare breakfast with unfamiliar ingredients and cookware. She had managed to start a fire in the stove but seemed uncertain about what to do next. When she saw him, she began to apologize, as though she had done something wrong. Thomas gently suggested they cook together. He could show her where things were kept, and she could teach him what she preferred to eat. It was a simple proposal, but it seemed to ease something in her shoulders. They worked side by side, not speaking much but learning each other's habits. Rebecca was careful and deliberate in her movements, while Thomas tended to rush through tasks he had done countless times before. The meal they produced was nothing special. Eggs that were slightly overcooked and coffee that was stronger than necessary. But they had made it together, and that felt significant somehow. After breakfast, Thomas explained his daily routine. He worked the fields in the morning and evening, when the sun was less brutal. During the heat of midday, he often read or worked on repairs around the house. Rebecca was welcome to join him in any of these activities. Or she could rest, or she could explore the property. The choice was hers. Rebecca chose to follow him to the fields. She had never seen farming from the perspective of an owner rather than a laborer, and she was curious about the difference. Thomas planted cotton and corn, with a small plot set aside for vegetables. He worked methodically, his movements efficient and practiced. Rebecca watched for a while, then began asking questions. She wanted to know how he had learned to read, how he had saved enough money to buy land, how he had navigated the complex legal system that seemed designed to exclude people like him. Thomas answered as best he could, though some of the stories were painful to tell. He spoke of nights spent copying letters by candlelight, of coins hidden in places where overseers would not think to look, of Margaret's encouragement when the obstacles seemed insurmountable. In return, Rebecca began to share pieces of her own story. Her family had once been prosperous, but her father's gambling and drinking had slowly eroded their standing. Her mother had tried to maintain appearances even as creditors came to the door with increasing frequency. Rebecca herself had received some education, though it had ended when money became too tight to afford tutors. She could read and write well enough, and she knew basic arithmetic. This last detail caught Thomas's attention. He had been teaching himself to keep books and manage accounts, but it was slow going. Margaret had been better with numbers than he was, and since her death, he had struggled with the financial aspects of farming. Perhaps Rebecca could help with that, if she was willing. It would give her something useful to do and provide him with assistance he genuinely needed. The suggestion seemed to brighten Rebecca's mood considerably. She had been worried about feeling useless, about being a burden on Thomas's limited resources. The possibility of contributing something valuable made her stand a little straighter. They spent the rest of the morning discussing the practical aspects of running a small farm, and Thomas was impressed by the intelligence and insight Rebecca brought to the conversation. As the sun climbed higher and the heat became oppressive, they returned to the house. Thomas suggested that Rebecca might like to look through Margaret's books, which he had preserved but rarely opened since her death. Rebecca accepted the offer with obvious pleasure. She had not had access to books for months, and the prospect of reading again clearly delighted her. While Rebecca explored the small library, Thomas worked on repairing a section of fence that had been damaged in a recent storm. The physical labor felt good after the emotional intensity of the previous day. It gave him time to think about what he had done and what it might mean for both of them going forward. He had not planned to take responsibility for another person's welfare. His life had been carefully arranged to require as little interaction with others as possible. He worked his land, paid his taxes, and attended church when social pressure demanded it. He spoke when spoken to and minded his own business. It was a lonely existence, but it was safe and predictable. Now suddenly, he had complicated everything. Rebecca's presence in his house would inevitably draw attention and speculation. Some of that attention might be harmless curiosity, but some would certainly be hostile. There were people in town who resented his success, who would be happy to find reasons to cause him trouble. His relationship with Rebecca, however innocent, could provide them with ammunition. But as Thomas worked, he found that these concerns mattered less than they should have. For the first time in years, his house felt alive. There were sounds of movement from inside, the rustle of pages turning, the soft footsteps of someone exploring. These were not the sounds of intrusion, but of habitation. The space was being used as it was meant to be used. When the fence was repaired, Thomas returned to the house to find Rebecca sitting at the kitchen table with one of Margaret's account books open before her. She looked up as he entered, her expression serious but not unhappy. She had found some discrepancies in his records, she said. Nothing major, but a few calculations that needed correction. Also, she had some ideas about crop rotation and soil management that might improve his yields. Her father, for all his faults, had been a competent farmer in his younger days, and she had absorbed more knowledge than she realized. Thomas listened to her suggestions with growing respect. Rebecca was not merely intelligent. She was practical and observant. She had noticed things about his farming methods that could be improved, and her proposals were both feasible and sensible. More importantly, she spoke with confidence when discussing these matters. The frightened girl from the auction platform was revealing herself to be a young woman of considerable capability. They spent the afternoon working together on various projects around the farm. Rebecca proved to be skilled with her hands, able to mend torn fabric and repair broken tools with patience and precision. Thomas found himself relaxing in her company, talking more freely than he had with anyone since Margaret's death. Their conversation ranged from practical matters to books they had read, from memories of the past to hopes for the future. As evening approached, they prepared supper together again. This time the process was smoother, their movements more coordinated. Rebecca had begun to understand the layout of the kitchen, and Thomas had adjusted his usual routines to accommodate her presence. The meal was simple but satisfying, and they ate with the easy silence of people who were becoming comfortable with each other. After supper, they sat on the porch again. The air was cooler than the previous evening, and a gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the oak tree where Margaret was buried. Rebecca noticed the small grave marker and asked about it quietly. Thomas told her about his wife, about the dreams they had shared, and the future that had been cut short. Rebecca listened without interrupting, her face solemn in the gathering dusk. When Thomas finished speaking, Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised him. She said she could see why Margaret had loved him. There was kindness in him that went deeper than mere politeness. It was the kind of kindness that acted without expecting reward, that saw suffering and moved to ease it. Margaret had been fortunate to find such a man, and Thomas had been fortunate to find such a woman. These words, spoken so simply and sincerely, moved Thomas more than he expected. For 3 years, he had carried his grief like a weight that could not be shared. Now, for the first time, someone had acknowledged not just his loss, but the love that had preceded it. Rebecca had not known Margaret, but she understood what their marriage had meant to him. That understanding felt like a gift he had not known he needed. As they sat together in the comfortable darkness, Thomas realized that his life had already changed in ways he could not have anticipated. Rebecca was not simply a person he was helping. She was becoming a presence that mattered to him. Her safety and happiness were beginning to feel like responsibilities he had chosen, rather than obligations imposed upon him. The distinction was important, though he was not yet sure why. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, he knew. The town would have had time to absorb the news of yesterday's auction, and people would be forming opinions about what Thomas had done and why. Some of those opinions would be generous, but others would not. He and Rebecca would need to navigate the social complexities of their situation with care and wisdom. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, they were simply two people who had found unexpected companionship in a world that had not always been kind to either of them. They had shared food and work and conversation, and they had discovered that loneliness was not as inevitable as they had believed. It was a small revelation, perhaps, but it felt large enough to change everything. When Rebecca finally rose to go inside, she paused at the door. She thanked Thomas again, not just for the day, but for everything. Her voice was steady, no longer hesitant or fearful. She had found her footing in this new life, at least for now. And as she disappeared into the house and Thomas heard the familiar click of her door lock, he smiled. Tomorrow, he thought, she might leave that door unlocked. Or she might not. But either way, the choice would be hers to make. Thomas remained on the porch until the stars appeared, thinking about choices and chances and the strange ways that life could surprise even those who thought they had given up on surprise. Margaret would have understood this feeling, he thought. She had always believed in the possibility of new beginnings, even when they came disguised as endings, perhaps especially then. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Rebecca had arrived at the farm. Thomas was checking the corn when he saw dust rising from the road that led to town. A rider was approaching at considerable speed, which was unusual enough to make him pause in his work. The rider turned out to be Samuel Morris, the telegraph operator from town. Samuel was a thin, nervous man who rarely ventured far from his office behind the general store. His presence at the farm could only mean one thing: urgent news that could not wait for Thomas's next trip to town. Samuel dismounted his horse with obvious relief and mopped his forehead with a handkerchief despite the morning coolness. He had a message, he said, that had come through the wires the previous evening. It was marked urgent and addressed to any landowner in the county who might be affected by railroad development plans. Thomas accepted the telegram with growing unease. Railroad development had been rumored for months, but no official announcements had been made. The message was brief but alarming. Representatives from the Georgia Central Railroad would be conducting surveys throughout the region, beginning immediately. Property owners were advised to have their deeds and boundary markers in order, as discrepancies could result in disputes over compensation or land rights. Samuel waited while Thomas read the message twice. Then he leaned closer and spoke in a lower voice. There was something else, he said. Something that had not come through official channels, but through the kind of whispered conversations that sometimes preceded official announcements. Word was that certain influential men in the county had advanced knowledge of the railroad's preferred route. These men had been quietly purchasing land, or arranging for land to change hands in ways that would prove profitable when the railroad made its final decisions. Thomas felt his chest tighten. He asked Samuel to be more specific about these rumors. Samuel glanced around nervously, as though afraid of being overheard despite the isolation of the farm. He mentioned names that Thomas recognized. Judge Morrison, who had recently arrived from Atlanta to replace the previous county judge. Franklin Coates, who owned the largest general store in town and seemed to have his fingers in every business transaction. And others, men with money and influence who rarely concerned themselves with the welfare of small farmers. The most disturbing rumor, Samuel continued, involved James Hartwell. Rebecca's father had apparently been seen in several meetings with these influential men, meetings that took place in private and involved documents that were not meant for public viewing. Samuel did not know the specific nature of these documents, but the timing was suspicious. Hartwell's sudden decision to auction his daughter coincided exactly with his involvement in these mysterious meetings. Thomas thanked Samuel for the information and watched him ride away with a sense of growing dread. If the rumors were true, Rebecca's sale had been more than a desperate attempt to pay debts. It had been part of a larger scheme, one that might still pose a threat to both of them. He found Rebecca in the kitchen, working on the account books with the focused concentration that had become characteristic of her approach to any task. When he shared Samuel's news, her face grew pale, but she did not seem entirely surprised. She had suspected something was wrong, she said. Her father's behavior in the weeks before the auction had been strange, even for him. He had burned papers in the fireplace and had visitors who came and went at odd hours. Her mother had asked questions, but had received no answers. More troubling was Rebecca's memory of a conversation she had overheard between her parents. Her father had said something about making sacrifices for the greater good, about ensuring their family's future through difficult decisions. At the time, Rebecca had assumed he was talking about their financial difficulties. Now she wondered if he had meant something else entirely. Thomas and Rebecca spent the morning discussing what these revelations might mean for their situation. If Rebecca's father was involved in some scheme related to railroad development, her presence at Thomas's farm might not be the end of the story. She might still be valuable to the conspirators in some way, or her removal from her father's household might have disrupted their plans. The more they talked, the more convinced Thomas became that they needed more information. He decided to make a trip to town that afternoon, ostensibly to purchase supplies, but actually to listen for gossip and observe who was meeting with whom. Rebecca asked to accompany him, arguing that she might notice things that would escape his attention. After some hesitation, Thomas agreed. The trip to town proved illuminating in ways Thomas had not expected. The atmosphere felt different, charged with an undercurrent of tension and excitement. People gathered in small groups and spoke in low voices that stopped when strangers approached. At the general store, Thomas noticed that Franklin Coates seemed unusually interested in his purchases, asking questions about his farming plans and his need for additional labor. Rebecca, meanwhile, struck up a conversation with Mrs. Elizabeth Hayes, the midwife who had attended most births in the county for the past 20 years. Mrs. Hayes was a woman who knew everyone's business and was not shy about sharing what she knew with those she trusted. She seemed to take an immediate liking to Rebecca, perhaps recognizing a kindred spirit in someone who had faced difficult circumstances with dignity. Mrs. Hayes confirmed many of Samuel's rumors and added details that were even more disturbing. The land speculation was not random, she said. Someone with access to railroad planning documents was directing investors towards specific properties. These properties were being acquired through various means: legitimate purchases when possible, foreclosure proceedings when necessary, and other methods when owners proved reluctant to sell. The most shocking revelation came when Mrs. Hayes mentioned a particular document that had been causing excitement among the conspirators. It was described as a red leather ledger book that contained detailed records of all transactions and agreements related to the land speculation scheme. The book supposedly included names, dates, and amounts that would implicate everyone involved if it ever became public. Rebecca went very still when she heard this description. Thomas noticed her reaction and asked if something was wrong. Rebecca waited until they had left the store and were walking toward their wagon before she spoke. She knew about the red book, she said. She had seen her father with it many times in recent months. He kept it locked in his desk and would allow no one else to handle it. If Mrs. Hayes was right about its contents, that book contained evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy. Thomas felt a mixture of excitement and fear at this news. If they could somehow obtain the book, they might have the power to protect themselves and expose the corruption that threatened honest landowners throughout the county. But attempting to retrieve it would be dangerous, possibly catastrophic if they were caught. They discussed the possibilities during the ride home. Rebecca's former home stood empty now, her parents having moved to a smaller place in town after settling some of their debts with the money from her sale. It was possible that her father had left the book behind, hidden somewhere in the house. It was also possible that he had taken it with him or destroyed it entirely. The only way to know for certain would be to search the house. That evening, as they sat on the porch and watched the sun set behind the trees, Thomas and Rebecca made their plans. They would wait until the weekend, when most people would be occupied with church services and family gatherings. Rebecca knew the house better than anyone and would be able to search quickly and efficiently. Thomas would keep watch and provide assistance if needed. The decision felt momentous, a crossing of a line from passive resistance to active engagement with forces that could destroy them both. But Thomas found himself thinking of Margaret and the dreams they had shared of a world where people like them could live without fear. Those dreams seemed worth the risk. Friday brought unexpected visitors to the farm. Thomas was working in the vegetable garden when he saw a carriage approaching from town. As it drew closer, he recognized Judge Morrison's distinctive black buggy. The judge was not alone. Franklin Coates sat beside him, and a third man Thomas did not recognize occupied the rear seat. Thomas called to Rebecca, who was hanging laundry behind the house. She appeared quickly, took one look at the approaching carriage, and disappeared back inside. Thomas did not blame her for wanting to avoid this confrontation, whatever it might bring. Judge Morrison was a large man with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that came from years of wielding authority. He climbed down from the carriage with the deliberate movements of someone who expected others to wait for his convenience. Franklin Coates followed, his round face flushed from the heat and the effort of the journey. The third man remained in the carriage, watching the proceedings with sharp, calculating eyes. The judge introduced himself formally, as though Thomas might not know who he was. He spoke of routine visits to assess property ownership and boundary questions in light of potential railroad development. His tone was cordial, but carried an undertone of threat that Thomas recognized from his years of navigating relationships with white authorities. Thomas responded politely, but offered no information beyond what was strictly necessary. Yes, he owned the land. Yes, his deed was properly recorded. No, he had no immediate plans to sell or develop the property further. He answered each question directly, but volunteered nothing additional. Judge Morrison seemed frustrated by Thomas's reticence. He began asking more pointed questions about Thomas's background, his means of acquiring the property, and his current financial situation. The implication was clear. A former slave should not have been able to accumulate enough resources to purchase and maintain 40 acres of good farmland. There must be some irregularity that could be exploited. Franklin Coates chimed in with questions about labor and productivity. He had heard that Thomas was now employing additional help on the farm. Was this worker properly documented? Were appropriate taxes being paid? Again, the threat was barely concealed beneath a veneer of official concern. Thomas maintained his composure throughout this interrogation, but inside he was furious. These men were fishing for any excuse to challenge his ownership or create legal complications that might force him to sell. Their questions had nothing to do with railroad development and everything to do with intimidation. The conversation was interrupted by Rebecca's unexpected appearance on the porch. She carried a tray with glasses of water, which she offered to the visitors with perfect politeness. Judge Morrison accepted the water, but studied Rebecca with obvious curiosity. He asked Thomas to introduce his guest, using a tone that suggested there was something improper about her presence. Thomas introduced Rebecca simply as Miss Hartwell, a young woman who was assisting with household and farm management duties. He did not elaborate on the circumstances that had brought her to the farm, and Rebecca said nothing beyond polite greetings. But her presence clearly unsettled the visitors in ways Thomas had not anticipated. Franklin Coates, in particular, seemed uncomfortable with Rebecca's confident bearing and direct gaze. She was not behaving like a servant or a woman of questionable virtue, which were probably the only categories these men could imagine for her situation. Her obvious education and dignity did not fit their expectations, and this seemed to frustrate them as much as Thomas's evasive answers to their questions. After finishing their water, the visitors prepared to leave. Judge Morrison reminded Thomas that property disputes could be lengthy and expensive to resolve, and that it was often better to avoid such complications by being reasonable about development opportunities. Franklin Coates added that the economic changes coming to the region would favor those who were willing to adapt and cooperate with progress. The third man, who had remained silent throughout the visit, finally spoke as they climbed back into the carriage. He told Thomas that he represented certain business interests that were always looking for investment opportunities. If Thomas ever reconsidered his position about selling or developing his land, he should contact Franklin Coates, who would arrange a meeting. As the carriage disappeared down the road, Thomas and Rebecca stood together on the porch and tried to process what had just occurred. The visit had clearly been intended as intimidation, but it had also revealed information about the scope and organization of the conspiracy they faced. These men were not operating independently. They represented a coordinated effort with significant resources and influence. More importantly, their interest in Thomas's property seemed to go beyond its potential value for railroad development. There was something about his specific 40 acres that made it particularly valuable to their plans. Thomas began to wonder if his land possessed some quality or advantage that he had not recognized. That evening, Rebecca shared a disturbing memory that the day's events had triggered. Several months before her family's financial crisis became acute, a stranger had visited their farm and spent considerable time examining the land and water sources. He had claimed to be conducting a survey for agricultural improvement programs, but he had asked questions that seemed more relevant to mining or industrial development. Rebecca remembered that this visitor had been particularly interested in the creek that ran through her family's property and continued onto Thomas's land. He had tested the water quality and measured the flow rate with instruments she had never seen before. At the time, her father had seemed pleased by the attention, as though the survey represented some kind of opportunity. Now Rebecca wondered if that survey had been connected to the railroad development scheme. Perhaps the conspirators were not simply speculating on land values, but had identified specific natural resources that would become valuable when railroad access made them available to distant markets. If so, Thomas's farm might be targeted not just for its location, but for what lay beneath its surface or flowed through its streams. This possibility added a new dimension to their situation. If Thomas's land contained valuable resources, the pressure to acquire it would only increase. Legal challenges to his ownership would multiply, and offers to purchase would become increasingly difficult to refuse. Eventually, if other methods failed, more direct forms of coercion might be employed. Thomas and Rebecca spent the evening refining their plans for searching her former home. The visit from Judge Morrison and his associates had convinced them that time was running short. Whatever evidence the Red Book might contain needed to be found and secured before their enemies could consolidate their position further. They would go tomorrow night, after attending church services that would provide them with alibis and demonstrate their respectability to anyone who might question their activities. It was a dangerous plan, but the alternatives seemed even more perilous. They were already in the conspiracy's crosshairs. Their only hope was to find ammunition with which to fight back. As they finalized their preparations, Thomas found himself marveling at the changes that had occurred in his life over the past few weeks. A month ago, he had been a solitary man focused entirely on survival and the simple routines of farming. Now, he was planning what amounted to a burglary, in pursuit of evidence that might expose corruption reaching to the highest levels of county government. The transformation was largely due to Rebecca's presence in his life. She had given him reasons to care about more than mere survival, reasons to believe that resistance and change were possible. Her courage and intelligence had awakened qualities in himself that he had thought lost with Margaret's death. Whatever happened tomorrow night, he was grateful for this awakening, even if it led to disaster. Rebecca, for her part, seemed calmer than the situation warranted. When Thomas commented on this, she explained that uncertainty was preferable to helplessness. For months, she had felt like a leaf blown by winds she could not understand or resist. Now, at least, she had some agency in determining her fate. The danger was real, but so was the possibility of justice. They went to bed early, knowing that tomorrow would bring challenges that would test both their courage and their trust in each other. Thomas lay awake for a long time, listening to the familiar sounds of his house settling for the night and thinking about the choices that had brought him to this moment. In the morning, he would attend church and play the role of a respectable farmer seeking nothing more than to be left in peace. Tomorrow night, he would become something else entirely. But tonight, he was simply a man who had found an unexpected companion in his struggle against forces larger than himself. It was enough to help him sleep, despite everything. Sunday morning arrived gray and humid, with clouds that promised rain before evening. Thomas and Rebecca dressed carefully for church, understanding that their appearance and behavior would be scrutinized by people looking for any excuse to find fault. Rebecca wore one of Margaret's dresses, altered to fit her smaller frame, while Thomas put on his best shirt and the jacket he reserved for formal occasions. The ride to town was quiet, both of them lost in thought about what the day might bring. Church attendance was not optional for people in their position. Absence would be noted and interpreted as evidence of moral failing or disrespect for community values. They needed to be seen participating fully in respectable society, especially on the day before they planned to break into an abandoned house. The Methodist church stood at the center of town, its white steeple visible from miles away. Thomas had been attending services there since acquiring his farm, sitting always in the back pew and speaking to others only when spoken to first. His presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, a reminder to the congregation of changes they were still learning to accept. Rebecca's arrival beside him caused the kind of subtle commotion that rippled through a crowd without ever becoming overt. Heads turned, whispers were exchanged behind gloved hands, and speculative glances followed their progress to the familiar back pew. Thomas felt the weight of collective attention and disapproval, but Rebecca seemed unaffected. She held her head high and met curious stares with calm dignity. The sermon that morning focused on forgiveness and redemption, themes that Reverend Patterson delivered with particular emphasis, while looking frequently in Thomas and Rebecca's direction. The message was clear. Some sins could be overlooked if the sinners demonstrated proper repentance and submission to community expectations. It was a conditional offer of tolerance that came with strings attached. After the service, several congregation members approached them with the kind of forced pleasantness that masked deeper concerns. Mrs. Franklin Coates inquired about Rebecca's family and expressed sympathy for their recent difficulties. Her tone suggested that these difficulties were the natural consequence of poor judgment and moral weakness. Mr. Henry Dubois asked Thomas about his farming plans and whether he had given any thought to the opportunities that railroad development might provide. Through it all, Rebecca responded with perfect politeness while revealing nothing of substance. She thanked people for their concern, deflected personal questions with gracious non-answers, and demonstrated the kind of social skills that came from good breeding rather than recent training. Her performance impressed Thomas and clearly surprised those who had expected someone more easily dismissed or categorized. The most significant interaction came when Judge Morrison approached them as they prepared to leave. He had been watching their reception by other congregation members, and his expression suggested both calculation and frustration. He spoke to Thomas about community responsibility and the importance of setting proper examples for others who might be struggling with life's challenges. The judge's words were carefully chosen, but their meaning was unmistakable. Thomas's relationship with Rebecca, however innocent, was being viewed as problematic by important people in the community. If that relationship were to become more scandalous, or if other irregularities were discovered, the consequences might extend beyond social disapproval to legal action. Thomas responded with the same measured politeness he had shown during the judge's visit to his farm. He appreciated the community's concern for proper behavior and would certainly take those concerns into consideration in all his future decisions. It was a response that acknowledged the threat without submitting to it, and Judge Morrison seemed to recognize both the defiance and the intelligence behind Thomas's careful words. As they rode home from church, Thomas and Rebecca discussed what they had learned from the morning's interactions. The community was clearly divided about their situation, with some people willing to extend grudging acceptance while others actively sought reasons for condemnation. More importantly, Judge Morrison and his associates were applying pressure through social channels while preparing legal challenges that might prove more difficult to resist. The afternoon passed slowly as they waited for darkness. Thomas worked on routine farm chores, while Rebecca prepared supplies for their evening expedition: dark clothing, a shuttered lantern, tools that might be useful for opening locked doors or cabinets. They ate an early supper and tried to behave normally, though both felt the tension of anticipation. As twilight deepened into full darkness, they set out for the abandoned Hartwell farmhouse. Thomas had scouted the route earlier in the week, identifying a path that would allow them to approach the house without using the main road. They traveled on foot, leading Thomas's horse until they were close to their destination, then tethering him in a grove of trees where he would not be visible from the road. The Hartwell house stood dark and empty, its windows staring blindly across overgrown fields. Rebecca had lived there for 19 years, but now it felt like a place from someone else's life. She led Thomas around to the back door, which she knew could be opened with pressure applied in just the right way to a warped board that had never been properly repaired. Inside, the house smelled of dust and abandonment. Their footsteps echoed in rooms that had once been filled with voices and daily activities. Rebecca moved through the familiar space with confidence despite the darkness, guiding Thomas to her father's study where the red book was most likely to be found. The study was a small room that had served as the nerve center for James Hartwell's various business dealings. A large desk dominated the space, surrounded by shelves that had once held ledgers and correspondence. Most of these had been cleared out when the family moved, but Rebecca hoped that something might have been overlooked or deliberately hidden. Thomas lit the shuttered lantern while Rebecca examined the desk. The drawers had been emptied, but she knew about a secret compartment that her father had thought was his alone. She had discovered it years earlier while cleaning the room, and had kept the knowledge to herself, understanding instinctively that some secrets were dangerous to reveal. The compartment was concealed behind a false back in the largest drawer. Rebecca's fingers found the hidden catch, and the panel swung open to reveal a small space that had been designed to hold documents too sensitive for normal storage. The space was not empty. Inside, they found several papers and a small leather-bound book that matched Mrs. Hayes's description of the Red Ledger. Rebecca's hands trembled as she lifted it out, understanding that they held evidence that could change everything or destroy them both if they were discovered with it. Thomas held the lantern while Rebecca opened the book and began to read. The contents were even more damning than they had hoped. Page after page contained detailed records of land transactions, bribery payments, and agreements between railroad officials and local conspirators. Names, dates, and amounts were meticulously recorded, creating an unshakable record of corruption that reached from county officials to state legislators. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. As Rebecca turned the pages, she found entries that described her own sale not as a desperate measure to pay debts, but as a calculated move to place her in Thomas's household for specific purposes. The conspirators needed someone close to Thomas who could monitor his activities and report on his intentions regarding his land. Rebecca's father had not sold her to pay gambling debts. He had sold her to serve as a spy, believing that Thomas would inevitably take advantage of her situation and that she would have no choice but to cooperate with any instructions she received. The plan assumed that Rebecca would be grateful for any kindness and desperate enough to betray her benefactor if threatened with abandonment. The revelation hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She had known her father was weak and selfish, but she had never imagined he was capable of such calculated betrayal. The sale had been painful enough when she believed it was motivated by desperation. Learning that it had been a deliberate sacrifice for personal gain was almost unbearable. Thomas read the entries over her shoulder, his anger building with each detail. The conspiracy was more extensive and more ruthless than they had imagined. It involved not just land speculation, but systematic manipulation of people's lives and relationships. Rebecca had been treated not as a human being, but as a tool to be placed where she might prove useful. But there was more. The book also contained plans for the next phase of the conspiracy's operations. Thomas's land was indeed crucial to their scheme, but not because of its location relative to railroad development. The creek that ran through his property contained mineral deposits that would be valuable once railroad access made them economically viable to extract. Moreover, the creek provided the water rights that would be essential for processing those minerals. The conspirators had identified other properties with similar advantages, and they had developed strategies for acquiring each one. Some landowners would be approached with generous offers that were actually below the true value of their holdings. Others would face legal challenges to their ownership based on technicalities or fabricated evidence. A few, like Thomas, would be subjected to more creative forms of pressure designed to make their positions untenable. The book revealed that Rebecca's placement in Thomas's household was part of a broader pattern. Other young women had been maneuvered into similar situations with different landowners, all for the purpose of gathering intelligence and creating opportunities for manipulation. It was a systematic campaign of exploitation that treated human relationships as weapons to be deployed for financial gain. As they absorbed these revelations, Thomas and Rebecca heard a sound that froze them both. Footsteps on the front porch. Someone was approaching the house, and they were trapped inside with evidence that would condemn them if discovered. Thomas quickly shuttered the lantern while Rebecca closed the ledger and returned it to the hidden compartment. The front door creaked open, and they heard voices in the main room. Two men were conducting a conversation in low tones, apparently comfortable enough in their surroundings to suggest they had legitimate reasons for being there. Thomas and Rebecca crouched behind the desk, hardly daring to breathe as the footsteps moved through the house. One of the voices belonged to Franklin Coates. The other was unfamiliar, but the man's accent suggested he was not local to the county. They were discussing the search for something important, something that should have been found and secured weeks earlier. As they moved closer to the study, it became clear that they were looking for the same evidence that Thomas and Rebecca had just discovered. Franklin Coates entered the study and lit a lamp, filling the room with light that would make concealment impossible if he looked in their direction. Thomas tensed, preparing to fight if necessary, while Rebecca pressed herself against the side of the desk and tried to become invisible. The stranger joined Coates in the study and began examining the bookshelves and filing cabinets that lined the walls. He was methodical and thorough, clearly experienced in searching for hidden documents. When he reached the desk, Thomas knew they would be discovered within moments, but Rebecca acted with desperate cleverness. She deliberately knocked over a small object on the floor behind the desk, creating a sound that suggested a mouse or rat moving through the room. Both men paused, and Coates muttered something about the house being overrun with vermin since the family had moved out. The distraction lasted only seconds, but it was enough to shift the stranger's attention away from the desk toward the window, where he thought he had seen movement outside. He told Coates they should check the perimeter of the house to make sure they were not being watched. Both men left the study, and Thomas and Rebecca heard them exit through the front door. They waited in terrified silence for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes. When they heard nothing more, Thomas carefully reopened the hidden compartment and removed the ledger and the other documents it contained. They could not leave such evidence to be found by their enemies, even if possessing it put them in danger. The escape from the house required all the stealth and luck they could manage. Thomas and Rebecca waited until they were certain the searchers had moved to the far side of the property, then slipped out through the back door and made their way to where they had left the horse. Every sound seemed magnified in the darkness. Every shadow might conceal an enemy. They managed to reach home without being discovered, but both understood that their situation had become infinitely more perilous. The evidence they carried could expose the entire conspiracy, but it also made them targets for people who would stop at nothing to prevent that exposure. Moreover, the searchers would eventually realize that the documents were missing and would begin looking for whoever had taken them. Back at the farm, Thomas and Rebecca examined the ledger more carefully by lamplight. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its ambition and ruthlessness. Dozens of families had been targeted for manipulation or displacement. Public officials at every level had been corrupted or intimidated. The railroad development was merely a cover for a massive theft of land and resources that would enrich a few while impoverishing many. But knowledge of the conspiracy also revealed its weaknesses. The conspirators had been so confident of their success that they had documented everything in detail. The ledger contained enough evidence to bring down everyone involved, from local officials like Judge Morrison to state legislators who had been bought with promises of future profits. The question now was how to use this evidence effectively. Simply turning it over to law enforcement was not an option, since the ledger revealed that many law enforcement officials were part of the conspiracy. Sending it to newspapers might result in its suppression or in retaliation against Thomas and Rebecca before the truth could be revealed. Rebecca suggested a strategy that was both brilliant and dangerous. They should make multiple copies of the most damaging information and distribute them simultaneously to different audiences: honest newspapers in distant cities, federal officials who were not implicated in the conspiracy, and prominent citizens in neighboring counties who had the influence to demand investigations. The plan would require careful coordination and considerable risk. They would need to travel to different cities and towns to make their deliveries, exposing themselves to discovery and retaliation. But if executed properly, it would make suppression of the evidence impossible and would create enough public pressure to force official action. As they planned their campaign, Thomas found himself marveling at Rebecca's transformation from a frightened victim to a determined fighter for justice. The revelation of her father's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also freed her from any remaining loyalty to the people who had used her. She was now motivated by pure anger at the injustices she had witnessed and experienced. For Thomas, the conspiracy represented everything he had learned to fear and hate about the world that had enslaved him and continued to threaten people like him. But now, for the first time, he had the power to fight back effectively. The ledger was a weapon that could level the playing field between the powerless and those who preyed upon them. They spent the rest of the night making plans and preparing for what would essentially be a war against corruption and exploitation. It was not the life either of them had chosen, but it was the life that circumstances had forced upon them, and they would face it together, with courage born of shared purpose and mutual trust. Dawn found them exhausted but determined, ready to begin a fight that would either bring justice to their community or destroy them both in the attempt. The stakes could not have been higher, but neither could their resolve. They had seen evil in its most calculated form, and they would not allow it to triumph without a fight. The next few days would test everything they had learned about each other and everything they believed about the possibility of justice in an unjust world. But they would face those tests as partners, united by shared danger and shared hope. Whatever happened, they would not face it alone. As the morning sun rose over Thomas's farm, painting the sky in shades of gold and promise, both he and Rebecca understood that their old lives had ended. What began that day would either mark the birth of something better or the conclusion of everything they had tried to build together. But they would meet that uncertain future with courage, knowing they had chosen to stand for what was right rather than submit to what was easy. The first copies of the evidence left the farm hidden in Rebecca's sewing basket, bound for the newspaper office in Augusta. Thomas drove her there himself, both of them maintaining the fiction that they were visiting distant relatives. The editor who received the documents was a man named William Pierce, whose reputation for honest reporting had survived numerous attempts at intimidation. Pierce read through the copied pages with growing amazement and alarm. The evidence was more comprehensive than anything he had seen in 20 years of journalism. But he also understood the danger it represented, both to those who had gathered it and to anyone who dared to publish it. He promised Thomas and Rebecca that the story would appear in his newspaper within the week, but he also warned them to prepare for retaliation. Over the next 10 days, similar packages were delivered to newspapers in Charleston, Atlanta, and Richmond. Federal marshals in 3 different districts received copies through carefully arranged intermediaries. Prominent ministers and business leaders who were known for their integrity found evidence packages on their doorsteps with notes requesting their assistance in exposing corruption. The strategy worked better than Thomas and Rebecca had dared to hope. Stories began appearing simultaneously in newspapers across the region, each one corroborating the others and creating a momentum that could not be stopped or suppressed. Telegraph wires hummed with communications between reporters and officials, and suddenly, the small conspiracy that had seemed so powerful was exposed to scrutiny from far beyond its sphere of influence. But success came with a terrible price. Judge Morrison and his associates quickly realized who had stolen the evidence and began their retaliation with ruthless efficiency. Legal documents were filed challenging Thomas's ownership of his land based on allegedly irregular deed transfers. Tax assessments were suddenly revised upward, creating financial obligations that would be impossible to meet. Anonymous threats began arriving, warning both Thomas and Rebecca of consequences if they did not cease their activities. The pressure intensified when Franklin Coates organized a group of local men to visit Thomas's farm with what they called a petition of concern. The petition demanded that Thomas remove Rebecca from his household immediately, claiming that their living arrangement violated community standards of decency. The delegation made it clear that failure to comply would result in more forceful intervention. Thomas received them on his front porch, his calm manner concealing the rage that burned in his chest. He listened to their demands without interruption, then responded with words that surprised everyone present. He announced that he and Rebecca had become engaged to be married and would formalize their union as soon as proper arrangements could be made. Until then, Rebecca's reputation would be protected by the presence of Mrs. Elizabeth Hayes, who had agreed to serve as chaperone and witness to their conduct. This announcement created chaos among the delegation. Marriage between Thomas and Rebecca was not what they had expected or prepared to address. It legitimized their relationship in ways that made continued interference more difficult to justify. Moreover, the involvement of Mrs. Hayes, who was respected throughout the community, despite her willingness to associate with people of questionable status, provided a layer of social protection they had not anticipated. Franklin Coates attempted to argue that such a marriage would be inappropriate, given the circumstances of Thomas and Rebecca's initial relationship. But Rebecca herself appeared on the porch and spoke with such dignity and conviction about her choice to marry Thomas that the delegation found themselves unable to maintain their objections without appearing to disrespect her autonomy as an adult woman. The men left frustrated and angry, but they had lost the initiative in their campaign of intimidation. Thomas and Rebecca had successfully transformed their relationship from a scandal into a romance, from an arrangement that violated social norms into one that affirmed them. It was a brilliant tactical move that protected them both while deepening their actual emotional connection. For the engagement announcement had not been merely strategic. In the weeks since Rebecca's arrival at the farm, both she and Thomas had discovered feelings that went far beyond gratitude and protectiveness. Their shared dangers and shared purposes had created bonds of trust and affection that made marriage feel not just convenient, but inevitable. Mrs. Hayes arrived that very evening, bringing with her a determination to defend the young couple against any further harassment. She was a formidable woman who had delivered babies for 3 generations of families, and who knew enough secrets to make many powerful people uncomfortable. Her presence in Thomas's household provided both practical protection and symbolic validation of their relationship. The wedding preparations became a form of resistance in themselves. Mrs. Hayes organized a network of women who supported the marriage, creating a community of allies who were willing to stand against the forces trying to destroy Thomas and Rebecca. These women helped with sewing and cooking, but more importantly, they provided witnesses to the couple's respectability and happiness. Meanwhile, the evidence they had distributed continued to generate consequences for their enemies. Judge Morrison was recalled to Atlanta for questioning about his involvement in the land speculation scheme. Franklin Coates faced investigation by federal marshals who were examining financial irregularities in his business dealings. Several other conspirators quietly left the county rather than face the growing scrutiny. But the most significant development came when a federal prosecutor announced that a grand jury would be convened to investigate corruption in the railroad development project. The prosecutor had been appointed specifically because he had no local connections that might compromise his objectivity. His reputation for aggressive prosecution of public corruption cases struck fear into everyone who had participated in the conspiracy. The grand jury proceedings began just 2 days before Thomas and Rebecca's wedding. The timing was not coincidental. The prosecutor wanted to prevent any of the targets from fleeing or destroying additional evidence before they could be formally charged. The ledger that Thomas and Rebecca had recovered provided the roadmap for the investigation, but additional evidence was being uncovered daily as witnesses came forward and financial records were subpoenaed. The wedding itself took place in the Methodist Church, where Thomas and Rebecca had attended services together for the first time weeks earlier. Reverend Patterson performed the ceremony with obvious reluctance, but he could not refuse without providing grounds for official complaints about his conduct. The congregation was divided between those who attended out of genuine support and those who came to witness what they expected to be a spectacle. Rebecca wore a dress that Mrs. Hayes and her allies had created from cloth donated by supporters throughout the community. It was simple, but beautiful, designed to emphasize her dignity rather than to display wealth or status. Thomas wore his best suit, the same one he had worn to Margaret's funeral, but today it seemed to carry hope rather than sorrow. The ceremony was brief and traditional, but the emotions it evoked were profound. When Thomas and Rebecca exchanged vows, their words carried the weight of everything they had endured together and everything they hoped to build in the future. They were not just promising to love and support each other. They were declaring their determination to face whatever challenges remained with unity and courage. The reception that followed took place at the farm, with tables set up under the oak tree where Margaret was buried. It was Rebecca's idea to hold the celebration there, understanding that Thomas needed to include his first wife's memory in this new beginning. The gesture showed a generosity of spirit that moved everyone present and demonstrated the maturity that had carried her through so many difficulties. As the sun set on their wedding day, Thomas and Rebecca stood together on the porch where they had first begun to know each other. The legal challenges to their property continued. The grand jury investigation was far from complete, and their enemies remained dangerous. But they faced these uncertainties as husband and wife, united by love and by shared commitment to justice. The grand jury returned indictments against Judge Morrison, Franklin Coates, and 17 other men involved in the conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming, and the federal prosecutor's case was airtight. Most of the defendants chose to plead guilty rather than face trial, hoping for reduced sentences in exchange for their cooperation. The few who maintained their innocence were quickly convicted and sentenced to substantial prison terms. The railroad development project proceeded under new management with genuine oversight and fair compensation for affected landowners. Thomas's farm was indeed valuable for its water rights and mineral deposits, but he received proper payment for access rather than being cheated out of his property. The money allowed him to expand his farming operations and to build the school that he and Margaret had once dreamed of establishing. Rebecca's transformation from victim to advocate continued after their marriage. She used her education and her experience with injustice to help other families who faced similar threats. Working with Mrs. Hayes and other allies, she created a network that could identify corruption quickly and respond effectively. Her father's betrayal had taught her to recognize evil, but her marriage to Thomas had taught her to believe in the possibility of redemption. Years later, when visitors asked Thomas and Rebecca how their story had begun, they would smile and speak of an auction that had changed everything. They would talk about the courage required to do what was right when doing wrong would have been easier. They would describe the power of love to transform even the most difficult circumstances into opportunities for growth and service. The red ledger that had contained so much evidence of evil was eventually donated to the state archives as a historical document. Scholars who studied it marveled at the meticulous record-keeping that had made the prosecution possible. But for Thomas and Rebecca, it represented something more personal, proof that truth, however hidden, would eventually find its way into the light. Their marriage produced 3 children, who grew up knowing their parents' story and understanding the importance of standing against injustice. The school that Thomas and Rebecca built educated children of all backgrounds, teaching them not just letters and numbers, but the values of courage and compassion that their parents had lived by. On quiet evenings, Thomas and Rebecca would sit on their porch and watch the sun set over land that truly belonged to them. They would remember the fear and uncertainty that had brought them together, and marvel at the love and purpose that had sustained them through their trials. They had not chosen an easy path, but they had chosen a meaningful one. The community that had once viewed their relationship with suspicion came to see them as an example of what was possible when people refused to accept injustice. Their marriage had begun as a strategic necessity, but had become a genuine partnership that strengthened both of them. They had faced corruption and cruelty with integrity and kindness, and they had prevailed. Sometimes visitors would comment on the grave marker under the oak tree, wondering about the woman named Margaret who was buried there. Thomas would speak of his first wife with love and gratitude, explaining how her memory had guided him toward the courage to save Rebecca, and how her dreams had found fulfillment in ways she could never have imagined. Rebecca would add that Margaret's presence was felt throughout their home, not as a shadow from the past, but as a blessing that continued to inspire their work for justice and their commitment to each other. The 3 of them, she would say, were partners in creating the kind of world where love could triumph over fear and hope could overcome despair. As Thomas and Rebecca grew old together, they never forgot the lessons of their early days as husband and wife. They had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act rightly despite fear. They had discovered that love was not just an emotion but a commitment to seek each other's good, even when sacrifice was required. Their story became part of the local folklore, told and retold by generations who drew inspiration from their example. The auction that had threatened to destroy Rebecca's life had instead become the beginning of a love story that transformed an entire community. The man who had interrupted that auction with an offer of $35 had purchased not just a young woman's freedom, but the foundation for a legacy of justice and hope. In their final years, when visitors asked Thomas and Rebecca what they had learned from their extraordinary journey together, their answer was always the same. They had learned that every person possessed infinite worth that could not be measured in gold or silver. They had learned that true power came not from dominating others, but from lifting them up. Most importantly, they had learned that love, when combined with courage, could change the world. Thomas passed away first, dying peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78. Rebecca lived another 5 years, using that time to complete the memoir she had been writing about their life together. She donated the proceeds from its publication to the school they had built and to organizations that continued their work for justice and equality. When Rebecca joined Thomas under the oak tree where Margaret also rested, the entire community gathered to honor her memory and celebrate the remarkable life she had lived. The three graves became a pilgrimage site for people who needed to remember that love could indeed conquer hate, that truth could triumph over deception, and that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept the world's cruelty as inevitable. The farm continued to prosper under the care of their children and grandchildren, who maintained the school and the traditions of hospitality and justice that Thomas and Rebecca had established. The creek still flowed clear and strong, providing water for the crops and reminding all who saw it that some things endure despite the efforts of those who would corrupt or destroy them. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and promise, visitors to the farm would swear they could hear voices on the porch, a man and woman talking softly about their dreams for the future and their gratitude for the unexpected grace that had brought them together. The auction had ended long ago, but the love it had set in motion continued to bless all who witnessed its power. The red dirt of Georgia held their bones, but their story lived on in the hearts of all who heard it and chose to believe that redemption was possible, that justice could prevail, and that love, when tested by fire, emerged stronger and more beautiful than ever before.